So a couple more things that I want to finish our session with. A couple more applications to talk about. Firstly, looking at niche evolution, speciation mechanisms, a little bit on species delimitation that I know some folks are interested in. I think it's an exciting and expanding area for application of these methods. And then predicting species invasions. This just relatively short section, I just wanted to cover this question about niche evolution and trying to use these methods, particularly ecological niche models rather than distribution models, if you like, to think about speciation processes and how evolution occurs and trying to actually understand some of the basic principles of evolution. This is generally then the idea. This is Madagascar twisted a little bit just to make it look interesting because it was on the cover of Systematic Biology a few years ago. But this is the idea that we're trying to link the kind of information that we get from distribution models. That's what you see in the three different colours there, with a little bit of red for model overlap. But they're distribution models for these three different day geckos. I'm going to come back to this example a little bit later. But linking it with information about phylogenies, about using genetic data and that to build phylogenetic trees, and then to think about the relationships between species and therefore and the links to their ecological niches, and in effect how those niches have changed over time and what that might imply for speciation processes. And also how we can think about applying that for species delimitation, so for actually naming species. So again, it's linking different data sources. It's using the models, the distribution models, the niche models, to tell us one bit of information that we can then link to other bits of information. Classic paper from Science, Town Peterson and co. back in 1999 is a good starting point. I think the actual title of the article was Niche Conservatism over Evolutionary Timescales. And this was, I think, one of the early, possibly the kind of first attempt to use some of these methods to ask questions about how niches evolve and what that means for speciation processes. And in effect, what they did in this study was take a few dozen, I think it was, sister pairs. So they knew about the phylogeny, they knew about the most closely related pairs of species in Mexico. So this is a picture of Mexico, and there is a classic isthmus that I'm not going to be able to pronounce, but it's something along the lines of the isthmus of Tehuantepec. Someone else might have a better go at that. But this is, in effect, a narrow lowland point between two more highland areas. So it's an isthmus. It's a kind of geographic barrier, geographic break. And what they were finding from their observations of the species pairs and of the knowledge of the phylogenies were that these pairs of species were often distributed on either side of the geographic barrier of this isthmus. You got a pair, one of the sister taxa was on one side and the other sister taxa was on the other side. And what they then did was using an approach that we've mentioned called GARP, which was one of the earlier methods that had been used in this field. It's the GA in GARP is a genetic algorithm. The full name is a genetic algorithm for rule set prediction, GARP, GARP. It's not so important what the actual algorithm is. You could use any number of methods, but that's what they used. They took the occurrence records for the species on one side of this geographic divide, built their model, and then projected it across the whole area, including the other side. The same for the sister pair on the other side. They built the model based on the species pair on that side and then projected it to the other side. Okay? And what they did was use the occurrence records for the sister pair that wasn't used to calibrate the model as the test points. Okay, so we talked about this in our evaluation session this morning, data division. So they divided the data geographically, or really taxonomically, for the sister pair on one side. They built the model, and then they used the sister pair from the other side to test the model. And they came up with some validation statistics that essentially asked, how well does the model for the niche of the species on one side predict the distribution or the niche of the species on the other side. So they were asking for these closely related pairs, how similar or different are the ecological niches? And they're doing it in this geographic context. We're mixing this idea of ecological space and geographic space because it's what's happening to the ecological niches, but we've got this geographic context across this geographic divide. And the conclusion from their paper was that, as you see from the titles, that the niches are conserved. So over evolutionary timescales, meaning the kind of timescales by which these sister pairs had speciated and become two separate species, the niches were actually still pretty similar because the model for one species could predict the niche for the other species. So it was a way of arguing across these whole set of species pairs in this particular landscape that the niches were conserved over evolutionary timescales. And it was using exactly the same distribution methods, the same sets of occurrence records, the same environmental data, the same divisions of data to use the evaluation statistics. They were basically using kind of success rates combined with a binomial significance test. I think they approximated it using a chi-squared test if you actually read the paper, but it's in principle the same kind of test. So doing exactly that, but to draw some conclusions about evolutionary how niches change over evolutionary time, or in this case, kind of don't change. It didn't seem like the niche had evolved. So the speciation had happened geographically was the argument. Think back to what we talked about allopatric speciation in our Madagascar example. Well, that's what they're supporting here. They're showing that it seems to be some sort of geographic divide that's restricting gene flow. The niches are the same, but the argument was that therefore there's allopatric speciation, and that's the process by which these species are most likely speciated. John Weens and Catherine Graham published a paper 2005 that reviewed some of this. So if you're interested in niche evolution, some of these questions and the sections in there on using distribution models, this is a good review, a good starting point at least, back from 2005. And they came up with these kind of 4 scenarios, hypothetically, as to the kind of results that you might expect from applying a species distribution model or an ecological niche model to address this question. So essentially what you're seeing in panel A there is, suppose these are 2 populations. Again, hypothetically, they might be in some highlands. 2 populations. One we're depicting with the circles that are filled, and the other with the open circles. Much like Peterson et al. Did in that paper that I've just described, suppose we build models based on each population and then project them across the whole area, project them to the other population. There are different kinds of scenarios, different kinds of results that we might get. One is depicted here. Suppose we build the model for this species, or subspecies, or population, whatever it might be, and then project it. Well, hopefully we're going to characterize this, that's our kind of type 1 prediction, if you like. We're going to find that the species does actually, we can recreate the distribution of that species. But we might also find that the niche is conserved, or it's a similar niche for the other population. Suppose they're both on highlands, they're both in cooler climates, so that kind of would potentially make sense. But a key argument that they put forward was that if you've got some unsuitable habitat between those patches of those 2 kind of niches, if you like, then that might be an argument that there's restricted gene flow, and this could be put forward as supporting an allopatric mode of speciation. Right? It builds on the work that we did in Madagascar, or at least it's related to the work we did in Madagascar. So that was the argument that they put forward. Here's another scenario, is that you, looking at panel C, you build your distribution model again for one population, subspecies, species, whatever it might be, say for the coloured, the solid circles, and project it to the whole area. Well, you might characterize the niche of the other species, but you might also characterize, kind of the intervening area. So in this case, the argument would be that there is no environmental reason why there would be unsuitable habitat between those populations. They seem to be connected within one set of suitable environments. So this would not be an argument that those are distinct species occupying distinct habitats, but potentially, you know, maybe these are just one species. It's the argument that was put forward. Of course, the other case in panel D, the other possibility is that you build the model for the open circles and project it, well, you don't pick up the other population. So that would be an argument that those niches have diverged. Those species are interacting with the environment in a different way. They're occupying different parts of the environmental space. So that might be an argument, again, that actually those two populations aren't the same. They're potentially different species. Okay. There are complications here. There are debates in the literature. I'm trying to flag up that, you know, this is a kind of fundamental set of theories that were put forward in quite an influential paper back in 2005. So then let's think about testing those theories. So again, John Wiens with Ken Kozak this time published a paper in Evolution where they tested this for a bunch of North American salamanders. These are in the Appalachians, I think. And what they were doing, I think they were running Maxent models, but again, that's not important. They were running some algorithm to apply the principles that we've worked with to characterize the niches of the distributions of closely related species. They were also characterizing the distributions or the niches of areas between those populations. So here you've got one species, here you've got another species, and here you've got some absences in between. And they were looking at this geographically. They were building distribution models. So you see there that there's some areas where both species were predicted, some other areas where it's just one, and some other areas where it's just the other species. And they looked at this in a kind of principal components analysis as well. So they're looking really just in ecological space and looking at how on the most influential principal component, so I can't remember what it was, but it might be related to temperature or precipitation or something. The two species were the same, were very similar, but the absences where they knew the species didn't occur was very different. So they put this forward as an argument that the sister taxa were inhabiting similar ecological niches, but there's intervening unsuitable habitat. When you look at that geographically, the distribution of those environments is such that there is unsuitable habitat between those populations. And they argued, they put forward this argument that supports an allopatric mode of speciation. Similar ecological niches, but intervening habitat that's unsuitable. And the inference was that that supports an allopatric mode of speciation. I like to stick with some Madagascar examples. This is from some of the work that I've been involved in where we've applied some kind of similar theories, but to the idea of species delimitation, by which I mean actually trying to recognize and identify species. So in this case, we started with 3 subspecies of Phelsuma. These are day geckos from Madagascar. So there used to be these 3 subspecies that were identified and written up in the literature. But particularly Chris Raxworthy, who's curator of herpetology at the American Museum of Natural History and the lead on this work, seemed to think that morphologically at least these were potentially distinct species. So we combined 3 arguments here. We combined some information on morphology that showed that these 3 subspecies were quite distinct. We also built a bunch of distribution models using exactly the kinds of methods that we've talked about, where we characterized the geographic distributions of the niches, and we showed that essentially those species were occupying, or those subspecies were occupying really quite different ecological niches. On reflection, this was published back in 2007. I think we could have done a much better job of formally testing how similar those niches were. But just looking at it geographically, we found there was relatively little niche overlap, which was represented in the red there. We were finding that in general, these species were occupying quite distinct ecological niches within the landscape. And we then combined that with the, if you like, the nail in the coffin, which was the genetic data, which showed that these 3 subspecies, when those results actually came out, weren't even monophyletic. They weren't actually even the most closely related populations So these three strands of arguments that, based on the kind of traditional ideas of the morphology, the genetic data, but we added in this information on ecological niches, and this was published in Systematic Biology, that in effect we upgraded the three subspecies, put forward an argument that they should be upgraded to species level because the morphology indicated that, the genetics indicated that, and interestingly, in a kind of novel application, we showed that those subspecies were interacting with the environment in very different ways. They're occupying different ecological niches, which we put forward as an argument that they are more evidence that they were distinct species. Okay. Now, I've emphasized that this is, I think there's an awful lot of ground to be covered in this area. I think we're just picking away at some things that can be done, and I'm just flagging some of the earlier work in some respects, but key work in this area. But increasingly signals as well that perhaps these niches, this idea of ecological niche conservatism over evolutionary timescales isn't always the case. Actually, we're finding increasingly examples where this isn't the case. Here's some work by Catherine Graham and co. that was published in Evolution for some frogs in Ecuador, basically. So again, combining some information on the phylogenies, for this group, which species are more closely related to one another, building a bunch of ecological niche models, looking at them geographically in terms of their spatial distributions, and also looking at some kind of PCA analysis, much like the Kozak and Wiens paper that I've just pointed you towards. Go back to the paper to look at the details here, but the conclusion in this study was that they actually found differences in the kind of climatic niche, or the ecological niche space of sister pairs. So they were actually finding that very closely related species were actually more different ecologically than you would expect, almost as if the species had evolved to occupy different ecological niches. And they put this forward as a hypothesis that potentially needs a lot more work and a lot more evidence, but possibly that would be a result that would support a parapatric mode of speciation. Seems to be some indication that these species are occupying distinct, closely related species that are actually diverging and occupying distinct parts of ecological niche space. So this idea of parapatric speciation along climatic gradients or along environmental gradients is the idea that instead of an allopatric mode of geography where you have two populations that diverge because of the restricted gene flow between those populations, you actually have divergence along a gradient where populations are evolving in and occupying different parts of the niche space, and it's that actually pulls the species apart. The mechanisms become complex. You need some sort of assortative mating going on in order for those species to actually diverge. If you've got, within a scenario where there is gene flow, for those species to actually diverge. But as part of a bigger picture and the particular role that the niche modelling was playing with this, the argument was that these species are potentially diverging along a climatic gradient because the niche models were showing that the closely related species were really quite different ecologically. So contrast that with the results that we've just been talking about. They're very different. To give you another example of that, again sticking with our example from of Madagascar, what you're seeing here for Madagascar is a excuse me, basically a clustering of the different. It's not a distribution model or anything. This particular figure on the right, as you're looking at it, it's just a clustering of the types of climates that you have in Madagascar. So it's actually taking the WorldClim data that we've talked about, those 19 bioclimate variables, and running a cluster analysis on top of them and just saying which kind of patches in Madagascar have similar climates. So we find, for example, along this eastern escarpment that you get these big, long, narrow bands of similar climates, whereas the patterns are very different in other parts of Madagascar where you get more of a latitudinal gradient in different types of climates. point is that we have these kind of ecotones, we have these environmental gradients. So what we're interested in doing, and in fact what we're still very interested in doing, it's basically early days for this, but is looking at some of these areas where we have these strong climatic gradients, looking at sister pairs and asking, well, are those sister pairs potentially evolving to occupy distinct ecological niches? And this is one example for lemurs that was published just last year. Blair et al. Mary Blair was the lead on this. This was taking two sister pairs of lemurs, one sister pair, two species, building ecological niche models and plotting them exactly as we've been talking about, basically building the model for one, plotting it on the area, building the model for the other, plotting it on the area, and then looking at the amount of overlap between those distributions, and then applying some pretty cool approaches that have been developed by Dan Warren and some of his colleagues. If you're interested in this area, please definitely go and have a look at Warren et al. 2008 in Evolution, developing some methods to actually, instead of just say plotting the ecological niche models and asking, well, do they look like they're similar ecological niches, to actually developing a pretty good null model that allows you to much more robustly statistically test, are those niches more similar or not than you would expect given the environments that are available. So definitely go and have a look at that paper. It's basically a more robust statistical test really of, are those ecological niches different? And it's dependent on the environments that are available. Given the environments that are available, are those niches actually, diverging? And what we're finding is some cases of where it does look like you've got sister pairs without some obvious geographic divide that seem to be occupying very different ecological niches. So we're not talking about niche conservatism that we started with, we're actually talking about some sort of niche divergence. And then there is potentially an interpretation, I think it's early days, it needs to be combined with genetic information and the like, but that might be indicating that there's some sort of parapatric speciation going on there, i.e. divergence of the ecological niches rather than conservation of the ecological niches. Okay. That's all I wanted to say on that, was to flag up and give you some of the big picture issues. In effect, people are interested in taking phylogenies, taking closely related species, and looking at how niches vary between more and less closely related species. There are some cool methods that are out there for robustly or fairly robustly doing that using ecological niche models. You characterize the niche for one species, you characterize the niche for the other species, and then you test whether those niches are more or less similar than you would expect given the environments that are available. And it's kind of wide open at the moment because we've got plenty of cases where studies are showing that, well, we seem to have niche conservatism, and other studies that seem to be saying we have niche divergence, meaning that the niches are remarkably dissimilar. And that's then being related back to speciation processes. Can we infer some sort of speciation process? How the speciation occurred? Is it allopatric? Is it parapatric? Based on this understanding of ecological niches. Okay? I think it's another good area that I know some of you are interested in, and I think there's a lot of work to be done developing cool new methods to do this and actually then testing it in a whole suite of different environments and for different taxonomic groups. As usual, any references?